Chapter 23 discusses the U.S. and the Cold War. This is really the early stages of the Cold War because obviously this goes on for decades post-World War II, but this is really the onset of the Cold War. So towards the tail end of World War II, you have two major meetings between what's known as the Big Three, at Yalta and at Potsdam. So the first, Yalta, is a city in the Soviet Union. This meeting took place in February 1945. And then another meeting in Potsdam, which was one of the occupied cities in Germany after the surrender of the Nazi military. This took place in July of 1945. Now, the first meeting was attended by U.S. President FDR, but after his death, Harry Truman attended the meeting at Potsdam. Now, both conferences are all about what is the world going to look like after the war is over. There's certain post-war goals that can be agreed upon, like Germany being disarmed, Germany being divided into 4 zones that the 4 militaries of the nations occupying those 4 zones would police and have security over. Berlin would also be divided. War criminals in Germany and Japan would be tried for crimes against humanity. This is where the Nuremberg trials come in. Japan would be occupied chiefly by the U.S., and Poland would be occupied chiefly by the USSR. Poland becomes one of the first Soviet satellite states after the war. You can see famous photography taken at Yalta on the left with President Roosevelt, and at Potsdam on the right with Harry Truman. So after the war is over, the United Nations is formed. This was really the brainchild of some of the other meetings like Yalta, Potsdam, Bretton Woods even, which we already discussed. All of these conferences were starting to talk about what the post-war world was going to look like, and in that world, they wanted a United Nations. The League of Nations had failed after World War I, mainly because the U.S. refused to be a member, and they wanted to have a organization similar that would be more effective. So in the UN, there is the General Assembly. Any nation can apply to be a member of the UN and vote on just about anything. Then there is the UN Security Council. Now this is a group of 11 nations that can ask member nations to go take military action in a place in the world. We're going to talk about one of those very first actions later in this slideshow. There are 5 permanent member nations: the U.S., Britain, France, Russia, back then of course it was the Soviet Union, and China. There's 6 additional countries that belong to the Security Council, elected every 2 years. Today, instead of 6 additional countries, there's actually 10 additional countries. But this is the basic structure of the United Nations. One of the first actions of the United Nations is via a committee that wrote and issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was led by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and this is declared official in 1948. This is supposed to set the tone for the world of what the human rights of all citizens of all countries across the world deserve. So when you hear the term human rights violations thrown around, usually it is making reference somewhere to this declaration. So after the war is over, another lesson learned from World War I was that things like punishing war reparation payments was only going to set the stage for future conflict. So instead, not only does the United States join the United Nations, but they lead the way on the European recovery via plans like the Truman Doctrine, supporting any nation that's trying to resist communism. The best example of this is $400 million going to the nations of Greece and Turkey to offset any influence of the Soviet Union. And an even greater program, the Marshall Plan, gave economic aid to the nations of Europe to rebuild. In a 3-year window of time, there was $12 billion given, and that doesn't sound like a whole lot given some of the figures you hear coming out of government today, but rest assured, $12 billion in the late 1940s, early 1950s is an extremely significant amount of money. George Marshall, who was the brainchild of this plan, was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, and you can see him pictured to the right. Now, as far as back at home, again, lessons learned. In previous conflicts, when soldiers came home, they had trouble finding jobs. There was jumps in unemployment. There was usually some kind of economic downturn as a result of the turmoil. And in the United States, the GI Bill, officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, gave money for higher education and or various types of loans to soldiers so that when they came back, there was not as rough of an adjustment back into civilian life. The Iron Curtain. This gets its name from a speech given by, at this point, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1947. Shortly after the war, Winston Churchill was voted out of office in favor of someone else. He was nonetheless a voice that people respected, especially when it came to foreign policy, because of how he had dealt with the war and resisting Nazi Germany even prior to other allies like the United States entering the war. Anyway, so the Iron Curtain, and you can see on this map on the right where the Iron Curtain technically existed. So this separated democratic nations loyal to the United States and the NATO alliance. We'll come back to this in a moment. The NATO alliance, that is. And communist nations loyal to the Soviet Union. Their alliance system was known as the Warsaw Pact. And again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, the resistance by countries that the Soviet Union wished to have influence over, namely Czechoslovakia and Hungary. There's violent coups and or occupations that enforce Soviet influence in those countries. So there's a lot of pro or anti-communist tension in Europe following the war. One of the events that added to the tension between the democratic nations of the West and the communist nations like the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe is the Berlin Airlift. I told you before that Berlin was going to be divided up in much the same way that Germany, the greater country, is divided up. And so East and West Berlin exist as well as East and West Germany. The issue is that Berlin sits within East Germany, which was occupied by the Soviet Union. And at one point, Joseph Stalin thought it would be a good idea to cut off any aid shipments into West Berlin and not allow these aid shipments to pass through the part of East Germany that it needed to get to West Berlin. And the United States, in response, executed the Berlin Airlift, in which airplanes would fly over West Berlin and drop desperately needed supplies. A great book that is both an adult book as well as a children's version is The Candy Bombers. And it talks about how part of what was being dropped into West Berlin during the Berlin Airlift was not just desperately needed things like food and medical supplies, but also things to keep people's spirits up, like chocolate bars for the kids, decks of cards, board games to keep people entertained, and to keep people's spirits up despite the pro- and anti-communist tension. Eventually, Joseph Stalin lifts the cutting off of on-the-ground supply shipments via the road systems because of the success of the Berlin Airlift. So I said I would come back to NATO and Warsaw. So the U.S., Britain, and France lead the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO for short. And the Soviets led the Warsaw Pact. And each alliance was heavily involved in all sorts of things: military operations, building up nuclear weapons, trying to put people into space, eventually the race to the moon, spying on each other, propaganda against each other. There's all sorts of stuff that a NATO versus Warsaw mentality is developing. And so this term, the Iron Curtain, is becoming ever more serious. In 1949, for a couple of different reasons, people get all the more scared of communism. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the communist leader in China, successfully overthrew the government and made it a communist nation. Mao Zedong had been fighting this struggle throughout the 1920s and 30s, but after World War II, there was a vacuum for power. There was enough of an opportunity where Mao and his followers actually had Jiang Jieshi, the leader of the Chinese government at the time, driven out of power, and China became a communist nation. You can see on the right a copy of Mao's Little Red Book that I'm sure you learned about in global history. And so this is a scary moment for people. This is part of what leads to the Red Scare, which we will come back to. The second reason 1949 was a scary year is that the Soviet Union goes nuclear. Okay? Now you can see a map on the right of San Francisco. And San Francisco is used on the map to show what the capabilities of different nuclear bombs are. So the very first atomic bomb would have destroyed just about this much territory, colored in yellow. Now, in 1952, after learning that the Soviet Union now had the equal capacity to explode an atomic bomb, just like the United States had done to end the war, in 1952, the United States announces that it has a bomb 1,000 more times destructive than the A bomb. And so this gets the nickname the H bomb. And this really ignites the nuclear arms race between the two nations. So you could see here the strength of the 1952 weapon, and then more modern weapons that we have today that could destroy this much or even more. And you also have to remember that even though this is the direct, immediate destruction of an explosion of a nuclear weapon, that there's areas immediately surrounding and even further away that can suffer from radiation poisoning, that can certainly sicken people, and also in the closer you are to the central blast, it can kill you in time, depending on how much radiation you were exposed to. So 1949 is scary. The Soviet Union goes nuclear. China becomes communist. This is a scary time for people in the United States. I made mention of the UN Security Council, and one of the first actions that it would take, sending troops, namely led by the United States, into a country if something was viewed to be a violation of UN precedent. And so at the end of World War II in Korea, the Japanese army is driven out by the Soviets and the United States, invading from two different areas. There's no way they would have withstood the invasion. Plus, once the atomic bomb ends the war, even if the fighting had reached a stalemate, the Japanese would have withdrawn. And at Yalta and Potsdam, it's decided that North Korea would be communist, South Korea democratic, divided at the 38th parallel. And in 1949, abiding by all of the things agreed upon at Yalta and Potsdam, U.S. troops leave South Korea. Well, only a year later, in 1950, the North Korean army marches across the 38th parallel and invades South Korea. So President Truman wastes absolutely no time sending U.S. troops to defend South Korea, and because this was done at the request of the United Nations Security Council, Truman never formally declares war because he calls U.S. involvement a police action, and he calls it that because it's not just the United States acting on its own, it's acting on behalf of the United Nations Security Council. Now, General Douglas MacArthur, who had made a name for himself in the Pacific theater of World War II, is suffering some defeats at first, but then manages to push North Korea almost all the way to the Chinese border. But his success scares the communist forces, and so the Chinese actually come in on the side of North Korea, counterattacking against the UN-led forces, mostly the United States, back into South Korea. MacArthur wanted the authority from President Truman to bomb Chinese military bases to prevent them from taking any action against his troops, but President Truman denied him this authority because he didn't want this to expand into a greater regional conflict that could possibly also draw in the Soviet Union. And when MacArthur publicly criticizes Truman for this decision, he's immediately removed from command. You cannot, as an active service member, criticize the President of the United States because the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief, and you must abide by what they say. If you want to badmouth them, you must first formally retire, and then you can come out publicly. But because MacArthur had spoke as still an active general, Truman immediately removes him from command. So you can see the progression of the fighting here. You can see after the initial invasion that South Korea was almost overrun. Then, once U.S. forces arrive and lead the UN coalition, you can see that the communist forces are nearly overrun. Then, once they come in on the side of the North Koreans, the Chinese help turn the tide, and the armistice line at the end of the war is pretty much right where the border already existed. And so eventually we will learn about the end of the Korean War later when we discuss the Eisenhower presidency. And it was a relatively simple negotiation because they said we will simply go back to the 38th parallel boundary. So taking a couple steps back as far as chronology, we now can talk about domestic issues here in the United States. Lots of foreign policy, UN, NATO, U.S. involvement in those organizations. Now it's about what's going on at home. And in the election of 1948, this is one of the first times that the Democratic Party starts to show that some members are starting to turn against the traditional segregationist attitude, and that they think that there should be integration to some extent. And so Truman announces in the middle of his 1948 re-election campaign that he is issuing an executive order that would integrate the military, meaning there will no longer be segregated units in the United States military. Now, in a direct response, Southern Dixiecrats, as they liked to call themselves, nominated Strom Thurmond, who was the governor of South Carolina, to run for president in 1948. There was another person, Henry Wallace, a former FDR vice president, who also challenges Truman. Now, Wallace has centered his campaign around a return to New Deal-style government and renewing a relationship with the Soviet Union based on economic cooperation rather than the NATO versus Warsaw military confrontation mentality. So, really, it looks like Truman is done for. The party is divided almost three ways exclusively, but neither of the other Democratic candidates, Thurmond or Wallace, receive enough support to really draw too much away from Harry Truman. His biggest threat is actually New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who's the Republican candidate, against Truman. So for many, many, many weeks, it looks like Thurman and Wallace are going to strip enough support away from Truman for Dewey to win. Plus, Democratic New Deal style thinking towards government is thought of as outdated, no longer needed. The Depression is over. Let's turn to Dewey, a new, fresh voice. Well, there was a lot of confidence that Dewey would defeat Truman, but that's not how it played out. Truman fought hard in the campaign and managed to lose only 39 electoral votes to Strom Thurmond and absolutely none to Henry Wallace. And despite winning under 50% of the popular vote, he wins nearly 60% of the electoral vote and is reelected president. And in this famous picture, he holds up a copy of the Chicago Tribune that is reading Dewey defeats Truman, because when it went to print, it looked as though Dewey would win, and in fact, Truman held on and won himself, rather resoundingly, in the electoral vote. Now, towards the end of his term in office, in which he was already elected himself, he was already president because of taking over for FDR, but he's elected in 1948, and within the 4 years leading up to the election of 1952, Truman is losing popularity big time. He actually received some of the blame for China becoming a communist nation. Why didn't you do more to stop it? He's also very unpopular with the MacArthur removal from command decision, and accusations that the U.S. government had been infiltrated by communists and they were serving in Truman's cabinet. This just exacerbates the Red Scare, which I've already mentioned once. We'll come back to that in a moment. And so, as a result, Dwight Eisenhower, still very famous, very much in the forefront of the minds of the American people because of his leadership during World War II, particularly D-Day, and he is overwhelmingly elected president in 1952. Two other events, besides the foreign policy events that we've already mentioned, like the Chinese going communist and the Soviets going nuclear, the Hiss case was what made people think that the accusations of State Department members under Truman would be true. People assumed this could be true because Albert Hiss, who was a member of FDR's State Department, was convicted of committing perjury over accusations of giving secret documents to the Soviets. Even more famous and in the public eye is the Rosenberg case in 1950. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted and executed in 1953 for giving the Soviet Union information about the U.S. nuclear weapons development programs. The Rosenbergs were not the only ones, too. A member of the Manhattan Project, his name was Klaus Fuchs, and I believe I am spelling his name correctly. Klaus Fuchs was one of the physicists that worked on the Manhattan Project, and he gave a bunch of information to the Soviets as well. He, unfortunately, escaped from the United States before he could be put on trial for doing such things. Now, the Red Scare, both those foreign policy things and domestic policy things that scared the bejeepers out of the American public, led to the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. This Republican senator accused political leaders, as well as civilians if they spoke up, of being communists or communist sympathizers. So this ruined the career of a lot of politicians, actors, writers, educators. And when he attempted finally to accuse members of the U.S. Army, the hearings are televised for the first time. Now, this actually backfired on him. He thinks this is going to gain him even more notoriety, but when the American people saw how badly he was bullying and harassing witnesses at the hearings, he actually lost influence. And a newsman by the name of Edward R. Murrow actually kind of came out and spoke up against McCarthy publicly And by 1954, the Senate is voting to censure McCarthy for his actions. That's an official criticism. You're not removed from office. You're not like arrested or convicted of any crimes or anything like that. But it is a public display of the Senate does not approve of your behavior. You can see some visuals here. Folks carrying signs saying things like better dead than red, burn all Reds, Rosenbergs are traitors, they must die for their crime. Scary stuff. Arthur Miller, in this time period, wrote his famous screenplay, The Crucible, about the Salem witch trials, and it's meant to be kind of satirical. Although it is a very serious story, it's satirically being compared to the Red Scare and to McCarthyism. And then a great film about Edward R. Murrow, and here's the actor. I do not recall his name off the top of my head at this time, but he depicts Edward R. Murrow in this film, Good Night and Good Luck, and the standing up to McCarthy that he did, which took real guts because he knew he was putting his career on the line. Other people's careers had been ruined by McCarthy. What would stop him from ruining his? So Murrow was a very brave person for standing up to Senator McCarthy. That is the end of the Cold War lecture. And if you have any questions, by all means reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in class.